It started as a regular Tuesday morning in Maplewood Estates. It's a kind of neighborhood where everything looked picture-perfect on the surface, but carried 1,000 cracks beneath. The lawns were trimmed to identical lengths, mailboxes painted the same dull beige, and every driveway seemed to host the same rotation of SUVs and sedans. Nothing stood out except my truck. It wasn't flashy or lifted sky-high like the stereotype you'd expect. It wasn't plastered in decals or roaring. With custom exhaust, my truck was a late-model Ford F250, reliable, clean, and well-maintained. It was more than a vehicle, it was a lifeline. I used it for work, hauling tools, transporting heavy supplies, and getting contracts done that kept food on my table. But in the eyes of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, it was a blight, a so-called eyesore in a community obsessed with conformity. For years, the HOA board members had whispered about vehicle standards, but no one had ever been bold enough to enforce anything. That changed the day Sandra Holloway became HOA president. Sandra, with her designer sunglasses, endless string of pearls, and an aura of authority that could choke the air out of a room, was determined to leave her mark. She didn't see my truck as a necessity, or even as just a vehicle parked on private property. She saw it as a direct challenge to her rule. The first letter came in the form of a friendly reminder. At least that's what the letterhead said. But anyone who has ever lived under the thumb of an HOA knows that friendly is just code for do this or else. The letter claimed that my truck violated community aesthetics and was not in compliance with approved vehicle classifications. They cited an obscure clause in the association's bylaws that prohibited commercial or oversized vehicles from being parked in driveways overnight. The problem? My truck wasn't oversized, nor was it commercial. It was registered to me personally, no business logos, no racks, no modifications. It was in every sense of the word a normal vehicle. But Sandra had found her weapon, and she wasn't letting go. I brushed off the first letter. I assumed it was a mistake, maybe a clerical error. But 2 weeks later, the second letter arrived. This one was not a reminder. It was an official violation notice, with a warning of escalating fines, $100 a day for noncompliance. Right at the bottom of the letter, in bold type, was the line that made my blood boil. Failure to resolve this matter will result in legal action pursued by the HOA. That was the first time I realized this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. Cleared up with a quick conversation? This was war. The next HOA board meeting only confirmed it. Sandra stood at the head of the table like a queen addressing her court, flanked by her loyal followers. She spoke about protecting property values, about maintaining uniformity, and about upholding the community standards. And though I wasn't allowed to speak because according to HOA rules, homeowners could only address the board during a narrow public comment window, I watched as she made her case against me like I was some criminal. She painted my truck as a monster tearing down the carefully manicured image of Maplewood Estates. What struck me most wasn't just Sandra's vendetta. It was how quickly the rest of the board fell in line. Some nodded along without question, others scribbled notes, as if every word she spoke was gospel. A few homeowners, those who lived on my street, looked uneasy. They knew my truck. They knew me. They knew this was absurd. But in the world of HOAs, fear ruled. No one wanted to be the next target. The fines started piling up almost immediately. A $100 invoice 1 week, $200 the next, $300 the week after. It didn't matter that I filed appeals, that I sent in copies of my registration proving it wasn't commercial. I cited county regulations confirming the truck was classified as a personal vehicle. The board ignored it all. Sandra had her narrative, and she wasn't about to let facts get in the way. Soon, the fines reached $2,000, then $3,500, and with each letter, the tone grew more aggressive. Words like lien, foreclosure, and seizure of property began appearing. They weren't just threatening my truck anymore, were threatening my home. At night I'd sit in my driveway staring at that truck. It wasn't just steel and rubber. It was late nights on job sites. It was early mornings hauling lumber. It was the contract that paid for my daughter's braces. It was the livelihood that Sandra was trying to erase with the stroke of a pen. And that's when I realized if Sandra wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to roll over and sell my truck, or worse, let them strip away my property rights. This wasn't just about a vehicle anymore. It was about control. It was about standing up against a system that thought it could bully and intimidate with no consequences. So I made a decision that changed everything. I called my lawyer the next morning. I handed over every letter, every fine notice, every piece of correspondence from the HOA. My lawyer flipped through them with a calm, practiced expression, and then leaned back in his chair with the kind of confidence that made me realize I had been fighting with one hand tied behind my back, because while Sandra thought she was the law, she was about to find out that the actual law was not on her side. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, I wasn't fighting alone, and as the HOA prepared to escalate, filing threats of liens and hearings, I was preparing to. Only this time, I had someone who knew exactly how to dismantle Sandra's empire piece by piece. The battle lines were drawn, and the next move belonged to me. The first shot across the bow came in the form of a certified letter, hand-delivered to my doorstep with all the ceremony of a court summons. The envelope bore the HOA's seal, and inside was a notice of escalation. Sandra had decided to pursue legal enforcement, claiming I was in breach of the association's bylaws and now subject to lien proceedings. It was an intimidating document, thick with legal jargon designed to scare any homeowner into submission. But I didn't flinch. I handed it straight to my lawyer. He read the notice, flipped through the attached bylaws, and smirked. It wasn't the smug grin of someone underestimating the opposition. It was the calm assurance of a man who had seen HOAs overreach countless times before and knew exactly how they tended to crumble when challenged. His words were simple. The HOA didn't have a leg to stand on. Over the next week, we prepared our response. He gathered evidence photos of my truck, copies of registration documents, records of my appeals that had been ignored. We combed through the Maplewood Estates bylaws line by line. Buried in the fine print was a crucial detail Sandra had conveniently overlooked: the restriction against commercial or oversized vehicles, applied only to vehicles with exterior business signage or equipment. My truck had neither. The language was clear. The truck was compliant. But Sandra wasn't about to back down. At the next HOA board meeting, she doubled down on her campaign, telling anyone who would listen that I was a rule breaker, threatening property values. She spoke with dramatic flair, warning of the slippery slope that would follow if others were allowed to defy the bylaws. She painted visions of RVs, rusted vans, and broken-down work trucks littering the streets if my case wasn't handled firmly. Her audience listened, some nodding along, others too afraid to contradict her. But what Sandra didn't realize was that this time, she wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting the law. My lawyer sent a formal CSN desist letter to the HOA, demanding an immediate withdrawal of all fines and threats of liens. It was professional, direct, and filled with citations from both state law and the HOA's own governing documents. In short, it exposed Sandra's crusade for what it really was: harassment. The response was silence. For 2 weeks, no new violation letters came. The fines stopped. The HOA's website, usually updated weekly with cheerful announcements and HOA board statements, suddenly went quiet. It was as if Sandra had pulled back to regroup to find another angle of attack, and then, just as I started to think the storm had passed, she struck again. One evening, I pulled into my driveway after a long day of work to find a bright orange sticker plastered across my windshield. It was an impound warning from the HOA, claiming my vehicle was unauthorized and subject to towing at my expense. Rage burned through me as I peeled the sticker off. This wasn't just another letter. This was escalation in its purest form, a direct attempt to remove my truck from my property. The next morning, I called my lawyer again. He was calm, almost amused, as I described the sticker. He assured me the HOA had no legal right to tow a registered, compliant vehicle from a homeowner's private driveway. He drafted another letter, this one even sharper than the last, warning the board that any attempt to tow would result in an immediate lawsuit for damages, harassment, and violation of property rights. It was then that cracks began to appear in Sandra's empire. Neighbors started approaching me quietly, pulling me aside at the mailbox or catching me in the driveway to whisper their support. They admitted they'd received their own petty violation notices, some for leaving garbage bins out too long, others for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Sandra's reign of control wasn't just about me, it was about everyone. And people were tired of it. One neighbor confided that Sandra had been pushing the board to create even stricter rules, including banning certain colors of vehicles and mandating garage-only parking. Another told me they'd tried to contest a fine once, only to be shut down with threats of additional penalties. Slowly, a picture formed. This wasn't just about my truck, it was about Sandra consolidating power. Turning Maplewood Estates into her own private kingdom, my lawyer suggested. We go further than just defending against the fines. He proposed filing a counterclaim, forcing the HOA to justify their actions in court. It was a bold move, one that would put Sandra on the defensive for the first time. If we could prove harassment and misuse of authority, not only would the fines vanish, but the HOA could face significant financial penalties. The board meeting that followed was unlike any other. Sandra tried to carry on as usual, but my lawyer was there beside me, a silent presence in a sharp suit that immediately shifted the tone of the room. Sandra rattled through the agenda, but when she reached the item concerning my truck, my lawyer calmly raised his hand. Though the rules didn't allow homeowners to speak outside of public comment, attorneys were another matter entirely. He laid out the facts, clear, precise, undeniable. He cited the bylaws, the law, and the letters the HOA had ignored. He explained in no uncertain terms that if the harassment continued, a lawsuit would follow. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Once Sandra didn't have a clever retort. She sat frozen, lips pursed, her authority suddenly cracked wide open in front of the very board she had controlled so effortlessly. But even with her silence, I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. Sandra wasn't the kind of person to surrender. She was biding her time, waiting for her next move. As we left that meeting, I felt the battle shifting. No longer was I a lone homeowner under attack. Now I had allies, both legal and neighborly. The HOA had been put on notice. But Sandra was not done fighting, and deep down, I knew the war was about to get uglier. Sandra had been quiet for nearly a month after that board meeting. And for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe the pressure had finally broken her. Maybe the threat of legal action, the presence of my lawyer, and the whispers of discontent among neighbors had forced her to back down. But if there was one thing I had learned about Sandra Holloway, it was that she didn't retreat, she regrouped. And when she resurfaced, it was with a strategy more aggressive than ever. One Friday afternoon, I arrived home to find an official-looking notice taped to my front door. Unlike the previous violation letters, this wasn't from the HOA directly. It was a notice of pending lien filed with the county clerk's office, initiated by the HOA on the basis of my so-called unpaid fines. Sandra had taken the fight out of the neighborhood and into the public record. If left unchallenged, the lien could damage my credit, jeopardize my home loan, and eventually allow the HOA to pursue foreclosure. I didn't panic. I picked up the phone, called my lawyer, and handed the document over. His voice was steady, almost reassuring. He explained that filing the lien without legal grounds was a massive misstep on Sandra's part. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore, it was fraud. Within days, he drafted a lawsuit, not a threat this time, but a real, legally binding complaint filed against the HOA and, by extension, Sandra as its acting president. The claims included harassment, abuse of authority, improper fines, and fraudulent lien filings. Damages sought: $75,000 plus attorney fees. When the news broke, Maplewood Estates erupted. Copies of the lawsuit circulated among neighbors like wildfire. For years, residents had grumbled about the HOA's overreach, but had never dared to challenge it. Now, someone had not only stood up, but was dragging the entire board into court, and people loved it. Support poured in, Neighbors I barely knew stopped me in the street to wish me luck. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, thanking me for standing up to Sandra. One family even slipped a gift card under my door with a message, "For your lawyer fund. Take her down." The pressure on Sandra intensified. At the next board meeting, the tension was palpable. Neighbors openly questioned her decisions, demanding to know why HOA funds were being wasted on legal battles. The treasurer, once her loyal ally, raised concerns about the mounting legal expenses. Whispers of a recall election spread like sparks in dry grass. For the first time, Sandra looked cornered, but still, she didn't fold. She hired her own attorney and prepared for court. And that's how, 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a county courthouse, staring across the aisle at the woman who had turned my life upside down over a truck parked in my own driveway. The proceedings were methodical, slow, and at times exhausting. My lawyer presented our evidence, every letter, every photo, every ignored appeal. He showed the judge the bylaw language, clear as day, proving my truck was compliant. He detailed the fraudulent lien and the emotional and financial strain caused by months of harassment. When it was Sandra's turn, her attorney tried to spin the narrative. He argued that the HOA was simply enforcing its rules, that Sandra was acting in the best interests of the community, that my truck truly was a commercial vehicle because of its size and utility. But every claim crumbled under cross-examination. The bylaws were unambiguous. My registration was valid. The lien filing had no legal basis, and then came the moment that sealed her fate. My lawyer revealed a discovery he'd uncovered during the case. Sandra herself had been violating HOA bylaws for years. She had installed an unapproved backyard structure, a lavish gazebo, complete with electrical wiring and plumbing that had never been submitted for board approval. Photos of the structure were projected for the courtroom. The silence that followed was deafening. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Sandra had waged a months-long war over a compliant vehicle while blatantly ignoring the very rules she claimed. To uphold the judge's ruling was swift. The lien against my property was declared void. All fines were ordered to be rescinded. The HOA was found guilty of harassment and abuse of authority, and they were ordered to pay $50,000 in damages, plus cover all attorney fees. On top of that, the court mandated that the HOA undergo independent review of its practices and adopt new policies to prevent future abuses. Sandra's face was pale as the gavel fell. Her reign as HOA president was effectively over. Within weeks, she was voted out in a recall election, her allies abandoning her one by one. The gazebo in her backyard was torn down under penalty of new enforcement. And just like that, the empire she had built on intimidation and control collapsed. As for me, the victory wasn't just financial, it was personal. My truck still sat proudly in my driveway, untouched, exactly where it belonged. But more importantly, the neighborhood itself began to change. Without Sandra's iron grip, Maplewood Estates started to breathe again. Rules were enforced fairly, not weaponized. Neighbors planted flowers of their choosing, painted their doors bold colors, and for the first time, the community felt like a place where people lived, not just existed under constant scrutiny. Looking back, I realized that Sandra's obsession with my truck had been her undoing. She thought she could bully me into submission, that her authority was absolute. But what she didn't expect was that I would fight back with the one thing stronger than her intimidation: the law. And in the end, it wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for everyone who had ever lived under the shadow of an HOA dictator, afraid to speak up, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand their ground to change everything.